Silas Voss didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door of the Millfield Land Office like he owned it, which, in every way that mattered in this part of the territory, he did. 3 men waited inside. County clerk, a nervous lawyer from back east, and a rancher named Graham Reyes, who had ridden 4 hours in the dark to be there by 8 in the morning. Graham had his hat in his hands and his papers on the table. He'd spent 2 weeks organizing those papers. Loan records, land certificates, a letter from his late wife's estate, everything he thought he'd need to negotiate an extension on the debt. Voss looked at the papers for about 4 seconds. Then he swept them off the table with one arm. Scattered across the floor, some sliding under the clerk's desk, one fluttering into the cold fireplace, and Graham stood there watching them fall, his jaw tight, his hands suddenly empty. "You're 3 months behind," Voss said, not raising his voice, which was somehow worse than if he had. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to inform you." Clerk looked at the floor. The lawyer looked at the window. Graham Reyes looked at the man who was about to take everything his wife had ever loved, and he said nothing, because what was there to say? He'd already lost. What none of them knew, what no one in that room could have predicted, was that somewhere on the road between Millfield and a town called Calder Flats, a woman in a blue traveling dress was sitting on a wooden trunk in the middle of the dust, trying to figure out if she had enough money left to buy a meal and a ticket somewhere, anywhere that wasn't here. Her name was Evelyn Hart, and the next 24 hours were going to change everything for both of them. If you have ever waited for someone who never came, if you have ever stood somewhere unfamiliar with your bags at your feet and realized the plan you'd built your future on had just dissolved, then you already know something about how Evelyn felt that morning. She hadn't been naive. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, sitting there on that trunk with the sun already mean and high and the stage depot behind her empty except for a dozing dog and a man who'd already told her, with the particular gentleness of someone delivering bad news to a stranger, that no, there was no message left for her. No letter. No one had come asking about a woman arriving from Ohio. Evelyn had written to a man named Charles Aldridge for 11 months. 11 months of letters, careful, honest ones, not the kind full of flattery and performance. She'd told him she was 34 years old, that she was not beautiful in any dramatic sense, but that she worked hard and didn't complain and could manage a household. She'd told him she'd nursed her mother through 2 years of illness and that after the funeral there was nothing left for her in Columbus. She'd told him she wanted something real, not something romantic. Partnership. A life that meant something. Charles Aldridge had written back with equal care, or what she'd believed was equal care. Described his land in the New Mexico territory good grazing acres, a house that needed a woman's touch, 2 horses and a mule. Described himself as a plain man, not given to sentiment, who respected a woman who knew her own mind. He'd enclosed a photograph, a man in his 40s, squinting into the sun, standing in front of a fence line. She'd looked at that photograph for a long time. Then she'd bought her ticket. She'd ridden 3 days by rail and half a day by stage, and she'd arrived in Calder Flats at 7:15 in the morning with a trunk, a smaller bag, $42 and some cents, and the particular kind of hope that you only allow yourself when you've already lost enough that hope feels dangerous. Stage depot man, his name was Burke. He'd told her when she arrived. Clearly someone who felt obligated to introduce himself when delivering bad news had checked the ledger twice. Even gone to ask the postmaster if anything had come for a Miss Hart in the last week. Nothing. He'd come back with that expression people get when they are sorry, but also relieved it isn't their problem. Could be he's just delayed, Burke said. Could be, Evelyn said. Good, but she'd already known, somewhere in the practical, unsentimental part of herself, that her mother had always called her greatest strength, and her aunts had always called her great flaw. But he wasn't coming. Man who was merely delayed sent word. A man who didn't send word wasn't delayed. She'd sat down on her trunk to think. That was 40 minutes ago. Dog had woken up, looked at her with mild curiosity, and gone back to sleep. Sun had climbed another notch. Evelyn had counted her money twice, as if counting it a second time might produce more of it, and had come to the same figure both times, $42.30, minus the 20 cents she'd spent on a cup of coffee that morning because she'd needed something warm to hold. $42.10. She'd need at least 12 of that to get back to the nearest rail junction. From there she could go where? Columbus had nothing for her. She had a cousin in St. Louis who had 4 children and a husband who drank and who Evelyn liked well enough, but who did not have a spare room or a spare dollar. She had a former colleague from the schoolhouse in Cleveland, where she'd taught for 3 years before head school had closed and left her without income, who had written once in 2 years and whose address she wasn't certain of anymore. Trunk dug into the backs of her legs. She thought, I am 34 years old, and I am sitting on my luggage in a town I have never been to, and I have $42, and I do not know a single person within 500 miles of where I am sitting. Then she picked up her smaller bag. Because she could not drag the trunk in this heat, she started walking, not toward anything in particular, just away from the depot, because sitting still was making it worse. She made it about a quarter mile before the heat became a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders, and she stopped at the edge of the road where a sparse cottonwood threw a narrow shadow. Then she put her hand against the trunk of the tree because the world had gone slightly sideways. She was not going to faint. She was very clear with herself about that. She had not fainted once in 34 years, and she was not going to start in a ditch in New Mexico. But she did sit down in the dirt. That was where she was sitting in the dirt under a cottonwood with her bag beside her, hat off, face tipped back, eyes closed against the white glare of the sky when she heard wagon wheels. Graham Reyes had not planned to take the south road back. He usually went north, cutting through the Harmon property along the creek line, which saved almost 40 minutes. But he'd left the land office that morning with his papers crumpled and his chest tight and a specific kind of fury that he didn't know what to do with. Then he'd gotten onto his wagon and pointed his horse in a direction and driven for 20 minutes before he realized he'd gone south without thinking about it. He noticed the woman before he'd have expected to, probably because she was sitting in the dirt, which wasn't something you saw every day. Slowed the wagon without deciding to. He took her in quickly. Way you assess a situation before you assess a person, a woman. Not young, not old. In town clothes that weren't built for this heat. Her hat was in her lap. Her eyes were closed. There was a bag next to her, but no horse, no wagon, no sign of anyone else on the road in either direction. Graham pulled the horse to a stop about 10 feet from her. She opened her eyes. They looked at each other for a moment, the particular wariness of 2 strangers, both of whom had already had a hard morning. Well, all right, he said. I'm fine, she said, which was clearly not accurate. He'd heard that answer before. His wife used to say it when she wasn't. His oldest daughter said it constantly and meant it about half the time. He'd learned not to argue with the answer directly. Got water? He asked, a pause. Not much left. He reached under the wagon bench for the canteen he kept there full. That morning he'd filled it at the trough before leaving town and held it out. She looked at it for a second like she was weighing something, then got up from the dirt carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who had decided not to let her legs embarrass her, and walked over and took it. She drank. Not desperately, but steadily, the way someone drinks when they are thirsty and have been ignoring it. Graham Reyes, he said, Evelyn Hart. She handed the canteen back. There was dirt on her skirt, a smear of cottonwood bark on her palm. She noticed him notice it and looked at her hand and then looked away. Where are you headed? He asked. The pause this time was longer. Long enough that he almost said never mind. I'm not certain, she said. He'd expected something, a town name, a husband's name, something. The honesty of that answer caught him off guard. Where'd you come from? Ohio, originally. Stage depot this morning. She seemed to make a small decision. I came here to get married. The man didn't come. Graham said nothing for a moment. He was not a man who filled silences just to fill them. That's a hard thing, he said. Yes, she said, it is. The horse shifted, impatient. Graham looked at the road ahead and then back at this woman standing in the dirt with her bag at her feet. He thought about the empty house he was going back to. And his 5 daughters, who were probably fighting about something by now. In the complete absence of any good answer to the situation Voss had just put him in. And he said, without having fully planned to, my ranch is about 8 miles east. My housekeeper left 3 weeks ago, and I've got 5 girls between 8 and 17 who I'm fairly certain have not eaten a real meal since Thursday. If you need somewhere to get out of the heat and think through your options, you're welcome to come. Evelyn Hart looked at him. He looked back. I'm not offering charity, he added, because he could tell she was about to say something about that. I'm saying I have a house that needs managing, and you appear to need a place to stand. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. Another long pause. How old is the youngest? She asked. Gate. Her name's Maisie. He almost said a handful, which was true, but that wasn't the right word. She talks a lot, he said. Something moved across Evelyn's face, not a smile exactly, but something adjacent to it. I'll come for today, she said. Just today. He nodded and moved over on the bench to give her room. Reyes Ranch was 8 miles east. As he'd said, and the road was rough enough that conversation was difficult, which suited them both. Evelyn sat on the bench with her bag in her lap and watched the landscape change flatter here than she'd imagined. With long views in every direction and a sky so wide, it felt like something that could press you down if you thought about it too hard. She did not let herself think about what she'd just done. She had gotten onto a wagon with a stranger. Seemed decent, which was not the same as being decent. She was not usually so trusting, but she had also been sitting in the dirt under a cottonwood, and her options were not numerous. She'd learned things about Graham Reyes in those 8 miles without asking many questions, because he was the kind of man who answered what he was asked, and not much more, but who answered honestly. That his wife had died 16 months ago, fever. That he had 5 daughters ranging from 8 to 17. That the ranch had been struggling since before Clara died, and was struggling harder now. That a man named Voss was trying to take it. That this morning had not gone the way he'd hoped. She'd told him. In exchange, she'd been teaching school until the position ended. She'd spent the last year corresponding with a man who apparently didn't exist in the form she'd imagined. She had $42.10 and no particular plan. She hadn't said anything comforting about any of it. She appreciated that. Ranch appeared around a bend, a main house, a barn, a scattering of outbuildings. All of it showing the particular kind of neglect that comes not from laziness but from too much to do and not enough hands. Fence line along the drive needed mending. There were tools leaning against the barn wall that should have been put away. Kitchen garden, she could see the outline of it from the road, had gone mostly to weeds, though something was still growing in the far corner, fighting. She noticed all of this before she noticed the 5 girls who had materialized from various directions and were standing in a rough line near the porch, staring. Graham pulled the wagon to a stop. "This is Miss Evelyn Hart," he said. "She's going to stay for a spell." There was a pause during which all 5 of them stared at her, and she looked back, taking them in. The oldest, dark-eyed, the arms crossed, with an expression that Evelyn recognized as defensive rather than hostile, 2 different things. And then, working down in age, a girl with her father's jaw who seemed curious, another who was looking at Evelyn's hat, another who was picking at a loose button on her shirt, and finally, breaking from the line before anyone said anything. The smallest, who ran up to the wagon and grabbed Evelyn's hand with both of hers. "I'm Maisie," she said. "Are you staying? Please say you're staying. Our house is too quiet." Evelyn looked down at those small hands wrapped around hers. "Just for today," she said, which was what she'd said to Graham and what she genuinely believed at the time. The house was not too quiet. Maisie had been either wrong about that or had meant something specific by it, the particular kind of quiet that fills a house when the person who used to be its center is gone and everyone is still, walking around that absence like it might bite them. Girls were plenty loud on their own. Within 10 minutes of Evelyn setting down her bag in the small room off the kitchen that Graham indicated with a gesture and the words, "This'll do for now," she had identified the following: Maisie, 8, who followed her room to room and narrated everything; Petra, 11, who had been trying to braid her own hair for apparently several days, with incomplete success; Lily, 13, who had strong opinions about how the kitchen should be organized and was prepared to share them; Ruth, 15, who was quiet in the way that 15-year-olds are quiet when they are watching everything; and Nora, 17, who had not come inside. Evelyn looked around the kitchen. The stove was cold. There were dishes in the basin that had been there long enough to tell a story. There was a pot of something on the counter that she lifted the lid of and then replaced quickly. Flour, salt, some lard, dried beans, a ham hock that was still good, 6 eggs. "When did you last eat?" she asked to the room. "Breakfast," Lily said. "What did you have?" A pause. Maisie raised her hand. "Crackers." Evelyn took off her travel jacket, hung it on the back of a chair, and rolled up her sleeves. "All right," she said. "Petra, go sit at the table where the light's better, and I'll fix your braid while the beans come up. Maisie, I need you to count me 6 eggs without dropping any. Lily, you're going to show me where things are, and while you're doing that, you're going to stop telling me how they ought to be arranged, and just tell me where they are." Can you do that? Lily stared at her for a moment. Probably, she said. Good enough. She had cornbread in the oven and beans coming to a boil, and Petra's hair successfully plaited before Graham came in from the barn. And he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the warm stove. The smell of food. All four younger girls in various states of occupation, with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Nora's outside, he said quietly. To Evelyn. I know, she said. She'll come in when she's ready. He looked like he wanted to say something else. Then he took off his hat and sat down at the table without saying it. Nora came in 20 minutes later, just before supper was on the table. She sat at the far end, ate without speaking, looked at Evelyn exactly twice, and left as soon as she'd finished. Evelyn watched her go and said nothing. Ruth, beside her, said quietly, She's been like that since Mama died. I know, Evelyn said, which wasn't quite true she'd known, since she saw the way Nora stood with her arms crossed, but close enough. That night, after the girls were in bed and Graham had gone out to check the stock, Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of weak tea and the financial ledger she'd found him leave open on the table. She hadn't gone looking for it. It was just there, open to a page of numbers that told a clear and ugly story. She looked at it for a long time. She was good with numbers. She had always been good with numbers. Kept her mother's accounts for 2 years. Managed the school's small budget with enough rigor that the board had never once questioned her. Stretched $42 across 3 months when she'd needed to. She could read a ledger the way some people read a face. One said was 3 months behind on the primary debt note, 2 smaller debts overdue, cattle income down from last year, grain costs up, no hired hand since March. She turned the page. The page after that was in a different hand, Clara's, she guessed, from the date at the top, 2 years ago. Neat, careful columns. The ranch had been making money then, barely, but making it. Evelyn closed the ledger. It wasn't hers to read, and she knew that. She sat there for another 20 minutes in the quiet kitchen, thinking about the numbers. In the garden, she'd seen fighting in the far corner against the weeds, and the tools left leaning against the barn. Nora's crossed arms, and Maisie's hands wrapped around hers. Just for today. That was what she'd said. She looked at the kitchen clean now, core cleaner, the smell of supper still in the air, the pot left soaking in the basin, and she thought about the room off the kitchen with its single window and narrow bed, and the $42 in her bag, and the absolutely unclear answer to the question of where else she would go. She didn't make any decisions that night. She was a practical woman, and practical women don't make decisions at night when they're tired and displaced and still faintly dizzy from the heat. But she did, before she went to bed, go back to the kitchen garden in the last of the evening light and pull 3 handfuls of weeds from the corner where something was still growing. The next morning, Nora was at the well before dawn. Evelyn saw her through the kitchen window, the oldest daughter, 17, with her dark hair loose down her back, hauling water with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done it so many times she'd stopped thinking about it. Evelyn watched her for a moment, then went back to building the fire. She didn't go out. She didn't make a show of the breakfast she was starting. She just made it oatmeal, because it was what there was. But she found some dried apple in a tin at the back of a shelf, and she cooked it in with the oats and a scraping of sugar. She put it on the table before anyone came down. Nora came in from the water hauling. She stopped when she saw the table. I didn't ask for that, she said. No, Evelyn agreed. You didn't. Nora looked at her. There was a specific kind of hostility in 17-year-olds who had been managing a household they were too young to manage. Evelyn had taught enough of them to know it. It wasn't meanness, it was a door. My mother's recipe box is in the top drawer, Nora said. Don't touch it. I won't, Evelyn said, and she kept the garden. One on the south side. I know. You've already been in it. Evelyn met her eyes. 3 weeds from the corner. Left everything else. Nora held that look for a moment longer, measuring something, though Evelyn couldn't have said what, and then she sat down at the table and ate the oatmeal without saying anything more. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't even the beginning of acceptance. She ate it. Evelyn took that and filed it away. Stayed past that first day. She stayed past the end of the week. She told herself it was practical. She had nowhere urgent to go. She could work for her keep, and the girls genuinely needed someone. She told herself it was temporary, which was easier than examining whether it was true. Work was not light. The ranch showed 16 months of accumulated falling behind, the kind of falling behind that looks manageable from a week away and enormous up close. She attacked it systematically, way she'd learned to approach any large problem. Most urgent thing first, then the next urgent thing. Don't look at the whole list all at once, or you'll sit down and never get up. Kitchen first, because the girls needed to eat and eating required organization. Then the garden, because the kitchen needed fresh food and the garden was a salvageable thing if you worked it before the season got any later. Then the mending pile, because 2 of the girls were going around with hems that were a hazard. And because mending was something you could do in the evenings when the light was gone and conversation was easier in the near dark. She taught the girls while she worked. Not formally, not as a lesson, just by doing the things with them instead of for them. Maisie learned to make cornbread. Petra and Lily learned to weed without pulling the good plants. Ruth, who was already capable of most things, she gave the harder tasks, jar sealing, brining, kind of preserving work that would matter in winter, and treated her as what she was, which was almost grown. Nora she did not try to teach. Nora she left alone mostly. She acknowledged her when they were in the same room. She consulted her about the household, where things were, what needed to be done, what the girls' routines had been, as a matter of genuine respect rather than strategy. Nora answered in short sentences. She never volunteered anything. She answered. It wasn't much, it was enough for now. Graham Reyes was harder to read than his daughters. He worked from before dawn to after dark, and what Evelyn saw of him in between was a man who was keeping himself upright through sheer stubbornness and whose stubbornness was starting to show the cracks. He thanked her for things in the particular way of a man who had been raised to thank people and meant it, but didn't know what else to do with the feeling attached to it. He ate supper with them when he made it in on time. He asked after the girls, individually. Each night not a general, how was your day, but specific questions. How did Petra do with the mending? Did Maisie's stomach settle? Did Ruth finish the chapter she was reading? She realized, watching him, that he knew his daughters in detail. He hadn't stopped knowing them when Clara died. He'd just run out of hands. One evening at the end of her second week, she found him at the kitchen table after supper, with the ledger open again, and the look of a man staring at a problem he can't solve by staring at it. May I? She said. He looked up. May you what? Look at the ledger. A pause. Why? Because I've been managing this household for 2 weeks and I should understand the larger picture. She said it plainly, not apologetically. You don't have to show me, but it would help. He looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man who wasn't sure what he was being offered or what it would cost him to take it. When he pushed the ledger across the table. She sat down and read it properly this time. Not at night, not standing up, but with full attention and the lamp turned up. She asked questions when she needed to. He answered them. They went through it together for almost an hour, methodically, practically, neither of them pretending it wasn't as bad as it was. When she was done, she sat back. You need to sell the North herd, she said. Not all of it. Half. The market's not good, but the debt is worse, and the note comes due before the fall prices will come up. I know, he said. The garden can carry us through the next 2 months if we work it hard. We won't have to buy vegetables. That's a small thing, but it matters at the margin. Evelyn. He said her name carefully, like he'd practiced it. You don't have to do this. I know I don't, she said. I'm choosing to. He looked at her for another long moment. Why? He said. It was a fair question. She thought about it honestly before she answered, because she owed him honesty. Because it's a problem I can help solve, she said. And I haven't had many of those lately. That wasn't the whole answer. She knew it wasn't, but it was the part she could say out loud, and he seemed to understand that it was the part she was offering, and he nodded and looked back at the ledger. Voss is coming back, he said. He'll come to the house this time. He likes that making it personal. I know, she said. Going to say things. About the debt. About you being here. He looked at her. He's going to use whatever is useful to him. I expect so, Evelyn said. Closed the ledger carefully. When he comes, she said, let me know. Graham looked at her, as if he were trying to figure out what she meant by that, and she let him look, because she wasn't entirely sure yet herself. But she was starting to be. The garden was something else. She'd known it the first time she'd looked at it, that rectangle on the south side of the house, gone to weeds and dry stalks, that Nora had told her about in that careful, warning way. She'd left it alone for the first week, respecting whatever it meant. She couldn't leave it alone indefinitely, not if they were going to eat. Started at the edges, the parts that weren't Clara's original design, the scrubby border where nothing deliberate had grown. She pulled and turned and worked quietly, without making a project of it. She found. She worked deeper. That Clara Reyes had known what she was doing. Beds were laid out intelligently. The spacing considered. And in the far section, where some woody herbs had been established long enough to survive the neglect. There was lavender and sage, and something she thought might be chamomile. She was on her knees in the sage bed one afternoon, her hands dark with soil, when she heard footsteps. She didn't look up. Mama planted that the second summer, Nora said from behind her. I can tell, Evelyn said. It's well established. We'll come back strong if we clear around it. A pause. She said sage was practical, Nora said. That you could always use it. She was right. Another pause longer this time. Evelyn kept working. She used to come out here after supper, Nora said. Just to walk through it. She didn't always do anything. She just liked to see it. Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at the garden, the whole of it, the way Clara must have seen it, a living thing that kept growing whether you watched it or not. I'm not trying to make it mine, she said. I want you to know that. I know, Nora said. It was the most she'd said to Evelyn voluntarily since that first morning. Evelyn nodded, stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees. She didn't make anything of it. She picked up her tools and went back toward the house. And she didn't look back. And she didn't say anything else, because some things you had to leave space for. She was a practical woman, Evelyn Hart. She knew that space was sometimes the most useful thing you could offer. She did not know, walking back to the house with her tools in her dirty hands, that within 48 hours, Silas Voss would come riding up that drive in his black coat and his good boots, with 2 men behind him and a folder of papers under his arm. And that what happened next would change everything, not in the smooth, inevitable way of stories, but in the messy, frightening, real way of things that matter. She didn't know that yet. She just went in to start supper. Silas Voss arrived on a Tuesday, which Evelyn would remember later, not because Tuesdays meant anything in particular, but because she'd been in the middle of teaching Maisie how to fold a pie crust when they heard the horses. Maisie's hands had been so carefully, so seriously positioned over the dough, and it was the last quiet moment of that kind for a long time. She heard the hoofbeats first 3 horses. Shh, she thought. From the sound of it, and then Graham's voice outside, glow and controlled, which was the voice he used when he was working to stay that way. Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window. Silas Voss was exactly what she'd expected, which was not a compliment to him. He was a big man going soft at the middle, dressed too well for a ranch visit, sitting his horse the way men sit horses when they want you to know they don't actually need to be on one. Behind him were 2 men she didn't recognize, younger, hired, who had positioned themselves a step back in the practiced way of men paid to be present rather than to speak. Folder under Voss's arm was thick. She could see that even from the window. Maisie, she said, without turning around. Go find your sisters and stay inside with them. Crust, put a cloth over it. It'll keep. She heard Maisie slide off the stool, heard small feet in the other room, heard her calling for Petra in the loud whisper of a child trying to be quiet. Evelyn took off her apron, hung it on the hook by the door, and went outside. Graham was standing at the edge of the porch, not on it, which told her he'd come around from the barn, which meant he hadn't had time to prepare himself. Voss had timed it deliberately, she thought. A man who made appointments gave you time to think. A man who arrived unannounced, wanted to catch you before you could. Came to stand beside Graham, not behind him. He glanced at her sideways, a quick look, then back at Voss. Mr. Voss, she said. She kept her voice neutral, pleasant enough. Can I get you water? It's a long ride from town. Voss looked at her the way some men look at women who speak before being spoken to, registering the fact of it, filing it somewhere. I'm not here for water, he said. He looked at Graham. I'll make this short. The note comes due in 31 days. I'm not extending it. You can meet it, or you can sign the transfer papers now, and I'll give you 60 days to vacate. He held up the folder. I had these drawn up this morning. Save everybody some trouble. Graham said nothing for a moment. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was holding something back. Got cattle going to market, he said. At current prices, you won't cover half of what you owe me. Voss said it without pleasure, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd enjoyed it. I've done the arithmetic. I imagine you have too. Then give me 60 days before the note falls due, not after. No. The word was flat and final, and Graham received it with the stillness of a man who had been hit before and knew how to stay standing. Evelyn looked at Voss. "What's your interest rate on the note?" she said. Voss turned to her. "Beg your pardon?" "The interest rate. On Graham's debt note." She said it evenly, as if asking about the weather. "I'd like to know what we're working with." A silence. "That's between me and Reyes," Voss said. "I'm asking because I'm trying to understand the mathematics," she said. Said current cattle prices won't cover half the debt. "I'd like to see that calculation." Something shifted in Voss's face, not anger, not quite, more like the recalibration of a man who's expecting one kind of conversation and was getting another. He looked at Graham. "Who is this woman?" he said. Graham met his eyes. "She's with me," he said. It wasn't a complicated sentence. It wasn't a legal designation or a formal claim. It was 3 words delivered flat and unambiguous, and Evelyn felt them land in her chest in a way she hadn't expected, and she kept her expression steady, because this was not the moment for anything other than steady. Voss looked between them for a moment. Then he tucked his folder back under his arm. 31 days, Reyes, he said. "After that, I'm done being patient." He turned his horse without waiting for an answer. His 2 men followed. They rode back down the drive without looking back, and the dust settled behind them, and Graham stood there watching until they were gone. Then he let out a breath that he'd clearly been holding for a while. "Thank you," he said quietly, not looking at her. "I didn't do anything yet," Evelyn said. "You stood there," he said. That was something. She looked at the road where the horses had gone, and at the folder she'd made Voss take back with him. And she thought about the ledger numbers she'd memorized, because she did memorize numbers. Which was one of the things about her brain she'd long since accepted. And she thought about 31 days. On what could be done in 31 days if you were willing to work and willing to think and willing to stop pretending the situation wasn't as serious as it was. "Come inside," she said. "I need to show you something." What she showed him spread across the kitchen table while Maisie watched from the doorway and Ruth leaned against the counter pretending not to listen. Was a plan that she'd been building in the back of her mind for the past week, without entirely admitting to herself that she was building it. Wasn't elegant. She told him that up front she wasn't going to dress it up. North Herd had to go to market, as she'd said before, but not through the usual channel, not to Millfield where the prices were dictated in part by Voss's influence over the buyer. She'd talked to Burke at the stage depot casually, while picking up a package, and he'd mentioned that a buyer out of Las Cruces had been moving through the area, paying 10% above Millfield rates. She needed to find that buyer before someone else got to him. The second thing, the back 40 that Graham left unplanted this season because he hadn't had the labor. It was too late for most crops, but not for a specific variety of late squash she'd grown in Ohio, a short-season cultivar that could come in under 12 weeks if the ground was worked properly. And the ground here, she'd tested it, was good. It wouldn't save them, but it would feed them through winter without spending cash on food, and every dollar not spent on food was a dollar that could go to the debt. Third thing was harder to say. "Your equipment," she said. "Some of it. The older plow, the supplemental harness sets you've got in the far side of the barn. Equipment you're not using because you don't have the hands to use it." Graham was quiet. "I'm not saying sell the ranch," she said. "I'm saying you have things sitting unused that have value, and value sitting unused doesn't help anyone." I was looking at the table, not at her notes, just at the table. "My father brought that plow out," he said, "from Missouri." "I know," she said, and she did know Nora had told her, not warmly in one of their brief functional conversations. She'd filed it. "I'm telling you it's an option, not a requirement. I'm telling you all the options." He looked up at her. "Why are you doing this?" he said. It was the same question he'd asked before, the night with the ledger. She'd given him a partial answer then. She thought about whether to give him the rest of it now. "'Cause I'm good at it," she said, "and because it matters." She looked at her notes on the table. "And because I've been the person who needed help and didn't get it, and it turns out I'd rather be on the other side of that." Ruth made a small sound from the corner. Evelyn didn't look at her. Graham nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "All right, you'll think about it? Or all right, we're doing it?" "All right, we're doing it," he said. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to take me to Millfield Thursday to find that buyer. And I need you to let me talk." He looked at her steadily. "You sure about that? Are you sure you want to keep this ranch?" she said. "Yes," he said without any hesitation. "Then let me talk," she said. Thursday came and went, and the buyer from Las Cruces was not at the Millfield Inn as Burke had suggested he might be. But he was at a place called Harker's, which was technically a feed store and technically also served whiskey. And he was a compact man named Aldous Fry, who turned out to be more interested in doing business than in the social arrangements of the woman across the table from him, which Evelyn respected. She negotiated for 40 minutes. Graham sat beside her and said 8 words total, all of them yes, or that's right, which was exactly what she'd asked of him, and which she could tell cost him something, and which she appreciated accordingly. Fry agreed to come out and look at the herd. Not a commitment, he said. Just a look. It was enough. On the way back, Graham drove for a mile without saying anything. And then said, Where did you learn to do that? Do what? Negotiate like that. She thought about it. School board, she said. 3 years fighting for supply budgets against men who thought chalk and primers were luxuries. She looked at the road ahead. Same principles. You know what you have, you know what you need, and you don't apologize for either. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was related to one. Voss has been doing this a long time, he said. He's got the county clerk. The sheriff's here. I know, Evelyn said. He's done this to other people. The Hanleys 2 years ago. Benedict's before that. He gets them behind on payments, sometimes he arranges to get them behind, and then he calls the notes. She looked at him. Arranges how? Salted wells. Sick cattle that showed up from somewhere. Fencing cut. He said it flatly, like he'd been thinking about it for a long time. Can't prove any of it. He's too careful. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Hanleys, she said. Do they still live in the area? Ada Hanley does. Her husband took work in Silver City. She's got a daughter with the Murphys. Helps out there. I'd like to talk to her. Graham glanced at her. Why? Because if Voss has done this before, there's a pattern, she said. Patterns have evidence, even when you think there isn't any. People remember things they don't know matter. He was quiet again. Then, you're not just planning to save the ranch. It wasn't a question exactly. She answered it like one anyway. I'm planning to solve the problem, she said. The ranch is the problem I can see. Voss is the problem underneath it. She watched a hawk cut across the sky ahead of them, low and direct. One thing at a time, she said. Fry first, then Ada Hanley. Fry came out on Saturday and walked the north herd for 2 hours. He was the kind of buyer who didn't show his reactions, which Evelyn recognized as a professional posture. She'd adopted the same one across from him at Harker's, and so she watched his hands instead, which were less disciplined. He ran them along the flanks of 2 of the animals, and his hands said one thing while his face said nothing. Offered 7% above Millfield rate. 10, Evelyn said. 8.5, Fry said. That's my ceiling. 9, she said. And you take them next week, not the week after. Need to move fast. A pause. 9, Fry said, next week. Shook hands. Graham, standing at the fence, watched the whole thing with the look of a man adjusting to a new piece of information about the world. Fry left. Graham came over to the fence where Evelyn was standing. 9%, he said. It's not enough on its own, she said immediately, because she didn't want him to think it was. But it's a piece. We need more pieces, I know, he paused. Still, 9%. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she understood suddenly that he was not just talking about the cattle, or not only about that, and she looked away before either of them had to figure out what to do with that understanding. I'm going to see Ada Hanley Monday, she said. I'll take the wagon if that's all right. I'll come, he said. You don't have to. I know Ada, he said. She'll talk more if I'm there. That was true and a reasonable reason, and Evelyn accepted it as such and did not examine the other possible reasons for it too closely. Ada Hanley was a woman who had been defeated and was still in the process of deciding whether to stay that way. She was 50-some years old, with the kind of face that had been pretty once and was now interesting, which was better in certain lights. She opened the door of the Murphy house where she worked and looked at Graham and Evelyn with wariness that softened a fraction when she recognized Graham and didn't soften much further when she was introduced to Evelyn. They sat in the kitchen because that was the only room available and because Ada didn't offer the parlor, which told Evelyn something about how Ada thought about herself these days. Evelyn let Graham do the first few minutes. How's your daughter? How are things at the Murphys? And she watched Ada while he talked. Ada had her hands in her lap loosely, but her fingers weren't still. She was listening to the polite questions and thinking about something else. We're here because of Voss, Graham said eventually. Ada's hands went still. I don't have anything to say about that, she said. I know, Graham said, but we have 31 days before he calls my note, and I've got 5 daughters. And Evelyn, he paused, looked at Evelyn. Gon looked back at Ada. She thinks there's something there. Something that could stop him if we can find it. Ada looked at Evelyn directly for the first time. Who are you? She said. Not rudely. Genuinely. I came here to marry a man who didn't show up, Evelyn said. I ended up at Graham's ranch. Now I'm trying to figure out how to help him keep it. Ada looked at her for a long moment. Voss cut our south fence line, Ada said. 3 nights in a row. Cattle got into the Brennan property. Brennan had every right to be angry. He didn't know it was deliberate. Just thought we were careless neighbors. But I'd mended that fence myself, both times before the third. I know that fence. Someone cut it. Did you tell anyone? Evelyn said. Who was I going to tell? The sheriff had dinner at Voss's house twice that month. I know because I saw his horse, Evelyn nodded. What else? Rada looked at her hands. Water. Our well went bad in the spring. Smelled wrong. We had it checked. Man from Field said it happened sometimes. Minerals from the ground. But it hadn't happened in 15 years of that well, and it happened right when we were 3 weeks behind on the note. She looked up. I can't prove anything. I know that. You don't have to prove it alone, Evelyn said. Ada was quiet. He did this to the Benedicts too, Evelyn said. Probably others before them. If every person he's done it to has the same story, fence lines, wells, sick cattle appearing from nowhere, that's not coincidence. That's method. And what do you do with that? Ada said. Take it to the sheriff. The sheriff who has dinner at his house. There are other people, Evelyn said. County commissioners. The land office regional inspector, who's not local and doesn't have Voss's dinner table to sit at. She paused. And there's the court of what people know. Voss does business here because ranchers deal with him. Those ranchers know what he does. Some of them will stop. Ada looked at Graham. You believe all this? I believe, Evelyn, he said. Ada made a sound not quite dismissive, not quite convinced. She looked out the kitchen window for a moment. The Benedicts, she said. Talk to Martin Benedict. He's at his brother's place outside of Deming now, but he comes through Millfield sometimes. Kept records. He's a careful man. He kept records of everything that went wrong, just in case. She paused. He didn't think anyone would ever care. Evelyn wrote down Martin Benedict's name in the small notebook she carried in her pocket, the one she'd originally bought to plan lessons in. Thank you, Ada, she said. Don't thank me, Ada said. Just don't let him do it again. Didn't talk much on the ride back from the Murphy place. Graham and Evelyn. Road was long, and the afternoon was getting hot, and there was a lot to think about. Somewhere around the halfway point, Graham said, he's going to come at you. When he figures out what you're doing, and he will figure it out, he's going to try to make it about you. Not about the debt, not about the ranch, about you. Evelyn had been thinking the same thing. I know. Came here as a mail-order bride for another man. He'll use that. Probably, she said. It doesn't bother you. She thought about it honestly. It's embarrassing, she said. It was embarrassing when it happened, and it'll be embarrassing when someone says it out loud in a public way. But embarrassment isn't the same as shame, and I didn't do anything shameful. She looked at the road ahead. I made a reasonable decision with the information I had. The information was wrong. That happens. Graham was quiet for a moment. You're harder to rattle than most people, he said. I've had practice, she said. He made that sound again, not quite a laugh. She was starting to be able to read his sounds, she realized. The way you learn to read the sounds of a house you've lived in long enough. She'd been at the ranch for 3 weeks. It felt both longer and shorter than that, depending on which way she looked at it. Nora found her in the garden that evening. Not in the confrontational way of the first weeks, just walked up and stood there, which was its own kind of change. Evelyn was staking the late squash seedlings she'd started indoors, and was now transplanting to the prepared bed, and she kept working while Nora stood, because she'd learned that Nora talked better when Evelyn wasn't looking at her directly. Papa seems different, Nora said after a while. How so? Evelyn said, pressing a stake into the ground. Less like he's just. Nora stopped. Tried again. He was doing what he had to do. Getting through. That's what it felt like. Since you've been here, it's different. Thinks there might be a way out. There might be, Evelyn said. I don't know yet, but there might be. Nora was quiet. Smiles sometimes, Nora said. Not often, but sometimes. Evelyn moved to the next seedling. She didn't say anything. Mama used to say the ranch needed a woman who loved it, Nora said. She meant herself. She was saying it about herself. A pause. I think she might have meant it more generally, though. I've been thinking about that. Evelyn sat back on her heels, and looked at the bed she'd been working the careful rows, the seedling small and pale and determined in the turned earth. "I'm not trying to be your mother," Evelyn said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," Nora said. "I'm not trying to make you forget her or replace her, or—" "I know," Nora said, a little more firmly. "I know that. I've watched you. You don't even use her recipe box. You asked me not to." "Yes," Nora said, "but most people would have anyway." Evelyn turned to look at her. Nora was looking at the garden with the expression of someone working through something that was still partly unresolved and knew it. She would have liked this, Nora said. Someone fighting for it. She paused. She was tired at the end. 2 years sick and still trying to manage everything. I think she was just so tired. Evelyn said nothing. Sometimes nothing was what was needed. "I'm not saying I'm fine with everything," Nora said. It's still hard. You being here is still hard sometimes." "I know," Evelyn said, "but I wanted you to know that I see it. What you're doing." Nora looked at her directly. "I see it." Evelyn held that look. "Thank you," she said. "That matters to me." It wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't the thing where everything changes at once, and the walls come down and everyone understands each other. Nora walked back to the house, and Evelyn turned back to her seedlings, and her knees were stiff, and her back ached, and the squash would probably need 3 more weeks minimum before they showed any real growth. It was something. It was a crack in a door that had been shut for a long time, and light was coming through it. Guy and Evelyn thought, "I will not push it. We'll just be here." The week that followed was the hardest kind of hard, not dramatic, just relentless. Fry came for the cattle on schedule, and the transaction went cleanly, which reduced the anxiety of that particular piece, but didn't eliminate the larger problem. Evelyn wrote a careful letter to the regional land office inspector, not making accusations, but asking specific questions about the process by which debt notes were filed and what recourse a landowner had if note terms were altered after signing. She didn't know yet if that thread would go anywhere. She pulled it anyway. She found Martin Benedict through a roundabout series of conversations. Graham knew a man who knew his brother, and she wrote him a letter too, explaining the situation plainly and asking if he'd be willing to talk. She didn't know if he'd write back. She planted the squash and watered them every evening. She mended a gap in the fencing along the north boundary that she'd noticed 3 weeks ago and that she was now no longer willing to wait for someone else to fix. Graham found her at it midway through, with wire and pliers and her sleeves rolled up, and he took over the stretching part without saying a word because she was competent at most of it, but her arms weren't long enough for the last stretch. They worked side by side for an hour without talking much. The kind of quiet that had texture to it, not uncomfortable. Something in between comfortable and something else she didn't have a word for yet. "Maisie asked me last night if you were going to stay," Graham said. Evelyn kept her hands on the wire. "What did you tell her?" "I said I hoped so," he said. A pause. "I said it was up to you." She felt him looking at her from the side. She kept her eyes on the fence. "She wanted me to ask you directly," he said. "She said I'd probably be too polite about it and you'd think I didn't mean it." Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest, against her better judgment. "She's 8 years old," she said. "She's not wrong," he said. She looked at him then. He was watching her with the steady, undemonstrative attention she'd come to recognize as the way he expressed things he didn't know how to say otherwise. "I haven't made any decisions," she said. "I know," he said. She stopped. Tried again. "There are things that still need to resolve. Voss, the debt. I don't want to make any decisions while things are unresolved. Doesn't seem sensible." "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." They looked at each other for a moment. "Ah." The late afternoon light was long and warm across the grass, and somewhere in the direction of the house she could hear Maisie and Petra arguing about something at a volume that suggested neither of them was actually upset. "Ask me again," Evelyn said, "when it's resolved, whatever it resolves to." Graham nodded. "All right," he said. She turned back to the fence. "Gah." He turned back to the fence. They finished the line as the light started going gold, and then they walked back to the house together because supper needed to be started. And the evening came down around the ranch the way evenings did out here, quickly, completely, without ceremony. It was not a promise. She was clear with herself about that. But it was the first time she'd let herself think about what the question might eventually be. And underneath all of it, 31 days away, Silas Voss had his folder of papers and his 2 men and his patients. And none of the things Evelyn was building were finished yet. She knew that when he came back, he would come harder than the first time. She knew that. She was not ready, but she was getting there. Martin Benedict's letter arrived on a Wednesday. 11 days after Evelyn had sent hers. She knew from the weight of it before she opened it that he'd kept records the way Ada Hanley had said careful. Thorough records. Kind that a man makes when he suspects no one will believe him and wants to be ready for the day someone does. She read it at the kitchen table while the girls were doing their morning work, and when she finished, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the paper. He'd documented 6 separate incidents over 14 months' fence lines on 3 occasions. Well that went bitter in the spring. Cattle that arrived sick in a herd he'd purchased through a middleman who, he'd later discovered, worked for Voss. Kept dates. He'd kept names. He'd kept, remarkably, a copy of the original note he'd signed, and a copy of the note as it appeared in the county records 3 months later, and the interest figure on the county copy was a 1/4 point higher than the one he'd signed. That was the piece she'd been looking for. She read that paragraph 3 times. Nah. Then she folded the letter carefully and put it in the small tin box she kept in the back of her trunk, the one that held the ledger notes she'd made, the letter to the regional inspector, and the responses she'd gotten so far, which were cautious but not dismissive. She locked the tin. She put it back in the trunk. She sat on the edge of the bed in her small room for 30 seconds with her eyes closed, thinking. This was not enough yet. One man's records, no matter how careful, were one man's records. She needed the Benedict's copy of the original note, compared against the county filing in a forum where someone with authority would have to look at both. She needed the regional inspector to actually come, not just to correspond. She needed time. What she had was 11 days left on Graham's note. She went back to the kitchen and poured herself a second cup of coffee and looked out the window at the sky, which was wrong. She'd noticed it the night before, a particular quality to the air, a pressure that sat behind the eyes. She'd grown up in Ohio, and she knew weather. She'd learned the particular weather of this territory in the past weeks from the way Graham and Nora both read the horizon without appearing to, the way the horses moved in the afternoon. Sky this morning was the yellow-gray of old bone, and the wind was doing something strange, coming and stopping, like something drawing breath. Graham came in from the barn at 7:30, which was earlier than usual. Looked at her and then at the window. "You see the sky," he said. It was not a question. "How bad?" she said. "Don't know yet." He took his hat off and hung it and poured his own coffee and stood at the window beside her. "Could pass north. Could hit us directly. The pressure's been dropping since midnight. Cattle. Fry took the north herd. What's left is the breeding stock. I need to get them into the lower field closer to the barn before afternoon." He paused. "Hay stores are in the barn loft, and I haven't reinforced the loft brackets like I meant to. If the wind gets bad enough, what do you need me to do?" He looked at her. "Keep the girls inside. Make sure everything that can blow is tied down or brought in. Tools against the barn wall, get them inside. Garden stakes, the loose boards on the south fence." He stopped himself. "I'll get Nora to help with the stock. She's better with the horses than I am in bad conditions. I'll handle the rest," Evelyn said. She spent the next 3 hours doing exactly that. Maisie trailed behind her, nominally helping and actually providing a running commentary on everything she picked up. Evelyn let her carry the lighter things and kept the more elaborate worry about the coming storm in the quieter part of her mind, where she put things that needed to be managed rather than felt. Petra and Lily she sent to fill every available container with water from the well, an overabundance probably, but she'd rather have too much than too little. Ruth she put to work securing the kitchen, making sure the dry goods were covered and the hanging pots were brought down, and the window latches were as tight as they could be made. By noon the sky was the color of a bruise on the western edge, and the wind had stopped stopping. Graham came back from the lower field with Nora behind him, both of them moving fast. "It's coming straight," he said. "We've got maybe 2 hours. Girls are inside," Evelyn said. "Tools are in, water's stored." He looked at what she'd done in 3 hours, and she could see him recalculating something. "Barn," he said. "I need to reinforce those brackets, and check the east wall. There's a board that's been loose for a month, and I haven't." "Go," she said. He went. Nora came to stand beside Evelyn on the porch, both of them watching the sky. "I hate these," Nora said. "I always have. Have you had bad ones here before?" 2 years ago, before Mama got sick." Nora's arms were crossed, but differently than before, not defensive. Just cold, or something that looked like cold. "We lost the chicken coop and part of the roof on the smokehouse. Papa was out half the night." "He'll be careful," Evelyn said. Nora looked at her sideways. "Will he?" It was a real question. not a challenging one. Evelyn understood what she was asking, not whether Graham was a careful man in general, but whether in the particular way of a man who had been running on stubbornness for 16 months, he might push past careful when something he loved was threatened. I'll check on him, Evelyn said. You should stay inside, Nora said. Probably, Evelyn agreed. They stood there for another moment while the wind picked up another degree, and the western sky went from bruise-colored to something darker. Then Evelyn went inside, and Nora followed her, and they closed the door, and Evelyn went to the window and watched the barn. Storm hit at 2 in the afternoon. Not builds slowly the way some storms do, it arrived all at once, as if the weather had decided that warning was a courtesy it wasn't going to extend. Wind went from strong to something structural in about 4 minutes, and the sound of it against the house was the sound of something trying to get in. Girls were in the main room. Evelyn had pulled the smaller ones onto the long settle bench with her, and Maisie had both arms around her waist and her face buried in Evelyn's side. And Evelyn had one arm around Maisie and one hand free, and she was listening to the house, to the storm, particular pressures, to what the sound was telling her. Lily said, the barn is solid, Evelyn said, which was what she believed, and not necessarily what she knew. Papa's in there, Petra said. He knows what he's doing, Evelyn said. Ruth was at the far window, the one that faced the barn, standing slightly to the side of it to keep from being in the direct line if the glass gave. She'd positioned herself there without being asked, which told Evelyn again everything she needed to know about Ruth at 15, the practical intelligence, the willingness to occupy the difficult spot. I can see the barn door, Ruth said. It's holding. Storm got worse. Evelyn had been in bad weather before Ohio in March could be brutal. Great Lakes effect, sending things down from the north that hit without ceremony. But this was a different kind of violence, horizontal and relentless, and the sound of it made Maisie press harder into her side. She kept her arms steady. She kept her voice steady when she spoke. She was calculating. Underneath all of it, how long had Graham been in the barn? What was the reinforcement work he'd been doing? How long did that kind of work take? Why had she not seen the barn door open? 20 minutes into the storm, Nora said, he should have come back by now. Might be waiting it out, Evelyn said. He wouldn't, Nora said. Come to the house to check on us. They looked at each other over Maisie's head. Ruth at the window, I can't see the barn anymore. There's too much dust. The wind hit the north wall of the house with a sound that made 3 of the girls flinch simultaneously, and Maisie made a sound against Evelyn's side that was not quite a word. Evelyn held her. Then, through the wall of the storm, she heard a horse screaming. It was unmistakable, that specific high, desperate register that horses reach when they are beyond ordinary fear. And it was coming from the direction of the barn. And it did not stop. Nora stood up. Nora, Evelyn said. One of them is caught in something, Nora said. If the east wall, you are not going out there. Papa's Nora. Evelyn stood up. Maisie made a sound of protest, and Ruth moved immediately from the window to sit beside her little sisters, which was exactly right, and Evelyn looked at Nora with the directness she'd been holding back for weeks because she hadn't earned it yet. You are 17 years old, and you are staying in this house. Do you understand me? Nora's jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright with something between anger and fear and the particular anguish of wanting to act and being told not to. He's my father, she said. I know, Evelyn said. Those 4 girls need you to be in this room. Horse screamed again. Evelyn looked at Ruth, who looked back at her with clear eyes. Ruth, Evelyn said, you're in charge. She went to the hook by the door and took down the heavy coat, Graham's coat, the canvas one with the deep pockets, and put it on. It was enormous on her, and it didn't matter, Miss Evelyn, Maisie said from the settle bench. I'll be right back, Evelyn said. She opened the door and the storm took it from her hands. The world outside the house was nothing like the world she'd been managing an hour ago. Wind hit her like a physical argument, sideways and mean, and she had to lean into it at an angle that felt wrong for walking, and was the only way to move. Dust was everywhere, not the gentle dust of a dry road, but something abrasive and total, and she had to squint her eyes nearly shut and navigate by the shapes of things she'd memorized rather than by seeing them. She knew exactly where the barn was, 42 steps from the back door of the house, bearing slightly right. She'd walked it enough times in the past weeks that her feet knew it without instruction, and she counted steps and kept her head down and didn't stop. The east wall of the barn was the first thing she found. She ran her hand along it, following it to the door. Loose board Graham had mentioned was gone entirely. Blown or worked free, And through the gap, she could hear the horse clearly now, frantic and rhythmic against something that was giving it pain. She got the barn door open against the wind by planting both feet and pulling with her whole weight, and she slipped inside and it swung shut behind her with a crack like a shot. Inside was dark. The storm had dimmed the afternoon to nothing and the smell was smoke. She stood still for exactly 2 seconds, understanding what that meant. Loft brackets. The hay. Something in the reinforcement work, or before it, a lantern knocked. A spark carried. "Graham," she shouted. The horse in the near stall, she could see it now. Shape of it, in the dimness. One of the breeding mares was turned against the corner. Her right foreleg caught in a section of broken fencing that had apparently come through the wall gap and collapsed into the stall. The wood was splintered, and she'd panicked and twisted, and was now wound into it in the way that made everything worse. Evelyn went to the stall without letting herself think about it. Mare was still fighting the wood, and Evelyn knew she could take her hand off at the wrist if she went in wrong. So she went in from the side the mare could see, and she put her hand flat against the animal's neck, and she talked not anything particular, just sounds that were calm and continuous and meant, "I am here, and I am not a threat." She kept it up while her other hand found the sections of broken wood by feel and began working them apart. Mare stilled enough. Evelyn got the leg free. She was breathing hard, and her hands were bleeding from somewhere the splintered wood. She'd figure out how bad later when she heard the sound above her that was not the storm. She looked up. The smoke was thicker in the upper part of the barn, and there was a faint orange at the edge of the loft floor, and below it, half obscured by a fallen section of the loft structure, she could see a man's boots. Graham. She was already moving, to the ladder, up it before she'd finished, thinking about whether the rungs would hold. "Graham, answer me." A sound, not a word, but a sound. She was conscious. She got to the loft level, and the smoke hit her hard, and she pulled the collar of Graham's enormous canvas coat up over her nose and moved toward the boots. The fallen section of loft structure, 2 heavy beams that had come down when the brackets gave, which was exactly what he'd been afraid of, had caught him across the lower body. Not crushing, but pinning. And the fire was at the far edge of the hay bales and was moving in the direction of the draft from the wall gap. She had time. She didn't know how much. She got her hands under the upper beam and lifted. "Didn't move, Graham." She put her mouth close to his ear. "I need you to push with your legs the moment I get this up. Whatever you've got. Do you understand?" His face was gray with dust, and there was blood at his temple, and his eyes were clearer than she expected. "Evelyn," he said. "Push when I lift," she said. "Are you ready?" "Shouldn't be ready." A pause. "Ready," he said. She got her back under the beam, not lifting with her arms. With her back and legs. The way you moved anything that was beyond arm strength, and she drove upward with everything she had. Again, she felt it shift. Graham pushed, and the beam rolled to the side and caught on something and held there. And Graham pulled himself forward on his elbows, and she grabbed his arm and hauled, and he was free. Fire had moved another yard along the bales. They went down the ladder, Graham first, slower than she'd like, his left leg working at about half capacity from the pinning, and she came behind him close enough to catch if he missed a rung. Didn't miss a rung. At the bottom he stood, tested the leg, grimaced. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes," he said, which was about 60% true, she estimated, and she put his arm over her shoulders anyway, and they crossed the barn floor, and she hit the door with her shoulder, and the wind took it again. They came through the back door of the house together. Graham's arm over Evelyn's shoulders, and both of them gray with dust and smoke. And the sound that came from the girls, when they appeared in the doorway, was several sounds at once. Maisie's immediate cry, Petra's sharp intake of breath, Lily saying something that might have been a word, and Nora, who had been standing in the middle of the room with her arms at her sides and her face completely controlled, who crossed to her father in 3 steps and put both arms around him and pressed her face into his shoulder. Graham held her. He was shaking slightly. Evelyn could feel it from standing next to him. The aftermath tremor that comes after the body has done something it wasn't certain it could do, and is now processing the fact of having survived it. "I'm all right," he said into Nora's hair. "I'm all right." Ruth appeared at Evelyn's elbow. "Your hands," Ruth said quietly. Evelyn looked down. Both palms were cut the right, one more significantly. A jagged line across the meat of the hand from the splintered wood, and she'd been ignoring it because there had been more important things to pay attention to. "I'll need the cloth and the water you heated," she said. "I already have it," Ruth said, which was so perfectly Ruth that Evelyn almost smiled. She let Ruth lead her to the kitchen. She sat at the table and let Ruth clean and bandage her hands with the practical efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage because management was necessary. And she sat there and listened to the sounds from the main room, Graham's low voice. Girls' voices, Maisie's, which gradually stopped being frightened and became its ordinary, unbroken narration, and she let herself breathe. Her hands hurt. She noted that with some detachment, the way you note information that is relevant but not currently actionable. The storm was still going outside. She could hear it. Graham came to the kitchen doorway. He looked at her hands. Wrapped now in clean cloth, gone, and at Ruth, who had done the wrapping. Thank you, he said to Ruth. Ruth looked at him steadily. Don't thank me, she said. Thank her. He came to the table and sat down across from Evelyn. He had a cut at his temple that someone had apparently seen to Nora, probably, and the gray dust look was beginning to clear from his face. But his eyes still had that particular quality of someone who has recently been adjacent to dying and is now sorting through the aftermath. You came out, he said. I heard the horse, she said. Shouldn't have. She was caught in the wood, Evelyn said. She'd have torn the leg apart. I don't mean the horse, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The mare's all right, she said, which was not an answer to what he'd said, and they both knew it. Evelyn. He said her name in the particular careful way he had when he meant more than the name. The loft was on fire. I know, she said. I was there. Went up there. You were trapped. He was quiet for a moment. The storm pressed against the house, and the lamp on the table between them flickered. I've been trying to do this alone for 16 months, he said. Everything. Ranch. Girls? The debt? All of it. After Clara died, I just stopped. Started again. I told myself that's what you did. You kept going. You didn't ask for help because there was no one to ask. Evelyn watched him. And then you showed up, he said, sitting in the dirt under a cottonwood tree. Ren, you've been. He made a small, frustrated gesture. Gesture of a man who knows what he means and can't find the shape of it. You've been everywhere at once. Girls. The Ledger, Fry, Ada Hanley, Benedict's letter, the garden, defense line. He stopped again. Ren, you went into a burning barn to pull me out from under a beam. Beam wasn't that heavy, she said. Evelyn. Graham. She said his name the same way he'd said hers, carefully, with the weight of the full meaning she intended. I know what you're trying to say, do you? I think so, she said. Ah. The lamp flickered again. In the other room, Maisie had apparently decided the storm was less frightening than something Lily had said, and her voice had acquired its characteristic indignant register. I'm not sure where things land, Evelyn said. I want to be honest about that. I came here with nothing, and it's been good here. Better than I expected any of this to be. But I'm a practical person, and I don't want to say things I can't follow through on, and there are still 11 days on that note, and Benedict's letter and the inspector's response, and I know, he said. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. She looked at him. I just wanted you to know, he said. What it means. That you're here. She held that for a moment. I know, she said, finally. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the full answer or the resolved question or the clean declaration. It was the truth of where things were, and she'd told him she'd ask him to ask again when things were resolved, and things were not resolved. She held his gaze, and he held hers, and in the warm light of the kitchen lamp, with the storm going outside, and 5 girls in the other room, and Benedict's letter in her trunk and 11 days left, she understood that something had shifted, not completed, but shifted, and that the person who had sat in the dirt under a cottonwood tree 5 weeks ago and counted $42.10 would not recognize this specific feeling. She wasn't sure yet what to call it. She thought she might find out. Storm broke sometime in the night. Evelyn woke to stillness, which was almost stranger than the sound had been, and she lay in the dark in her small room and listened to the quiet of the house and the ranch outside it, and she made herself think about what needed doing. Barn was the first thing. She'd gotten Graham and the mare out. She'd seen the fire eating along the top row of hay bales. She didn't know how far it had gotten before it either spent itself on the wet plastered wall or was suppressed by the storm's own rain, which had come in the last hour with the driving force of weather that has been building all day. She needed to know the barn's condition before she knew anything else. She got up before dawn and went to look. The east wall had lost 2 boards entirely, and a third was hanging, and the loft floor had partially collapsed where the beams had come down. In the far section of hay bales was a blackened mass that still smelled of smoke in the cold air, but the wall had held, and the fire had not reached the structural beams of the main frame, and the barn was standing. Damaged. Standing. She stood in the open east gap and looked at the sky, which was washed clean by the night's rain, and was now a color she'd have called impossible in Ohio, that specific western blue that had still not stopped surprising her. She heard footsteps. Graham behind her, limping slightly. The left leg was going to need a day or two, and he stood beside her in the gap and looked at the barn the same way she was looking at it. Frame sound, she said. Yes, he said. The loft will need rebuilding. East wall, those 3 boards. She looked at the blackened hay. You'll need to replace the hay stores before winter. I know. The mare's leg should be looked at. There may be splinter fragments I couldn't. Evelyn. She stopped. I know all that, he said. I've been ranching this land for 12 years. I know what it needs. She looked at him. I just want to stand here for a minute, he said. Before we start fixing it. She was quiet. Stood in the damaged east wall of the surviving barn, and the morning came in around them. Slow and bright and completely indifferent to what had happened the night before. The way mornings always were, Guy and Evelyn thought. The 11 days. She thought, Benedict's letter is in the tin box in my trunk. She thought, the inspector will respond or he won't. Then she let herself stop thinking about it, just for the length of a breath. Just for a minute, as he'd said. Squash seedlings will need checking, she said, finally, because she couldn't help it. He made the sound that was not quite a laugh. Of course they will, he said. They went, together, checked the squash seedlings, and found that 4 of the 12 had survived the storm intact. 3 more might come back if the soil had held enough moisture. That was not good odds, but it was not 0. Evelyn got on her knees in the wet earth and began assessing each one. Graham crouched beside her on his good leg, and the morning went on around them. Run in the house behind them, 5 girls began the process of waking into a world that had been rearranged by the night. So much still to do, the barn. The hay. Debt that was now 10 days away from its reckoning. And Voss, who would not stay patient much longer. Van Benedict's records that needed to reach the right set of eyes. And Ada Hanley's testimony that was not yet written down anywhere official. And the inspector, who had not yet committed to coming. So much still to do. Evelyn was on her knees in the mud, looking at a seedling that had bent in the storm and not broken, and she pressed the earth carefully around its roots. And she thought, still alive. Counts. Still alive counts for a great deal. 10 days felt different from 31. 31 days was a number you could hold at arm's length and work around. 10 days was something that sat in the room with you while you ate breakfast and followed you out to the barn and was there when you came back in. Evelyn felt it the morning after the storm when the mud was still wet and the east wall of the barn was open to the sky and the blackened hay smell hung in the cold air, and she decided that feeling it was fine as long as she didn't let it stop her hands. Her hands were stiff. Cuts had begun to close, but the right palm in particular had a deep soreness that made gripping things deliberate rather than automatic, and she'd learned in the past week to adjust her grip rather than favor the hand entirely, because favoring it made everything take twice as long. She had the tin box open on the kitchen table before the girls were awake. Benedict's letter. Her notes. 2 responses from the regional land office, 1 from a clerk, 1 from a man named Harlan Price, inspector of land transactions for the Southern District, who had written in the careful, neutral language of a bureaucrat who was interested but not yet committed. She'd been corresponding with Price for 2 weeks, and she had a reasonable sense of him now. Methodical, not corrupt, overworked, and constitutionally skeptical of claims he couldn't verify himself. What Price needed was to see the documents in person. What the documents needed was to be in a place where Price could be made to come. She'd been turning this over for days, and the storm had clarified it the way extreme things sometimes clarify what you've been avoiding deciding. She needed to go to Calder Flats. Not to correspond, not to send letters and wait. To go and stand in front of the people who needed to be stood in front of, with the documents in her hand and make them look. She also needed, before that, to go somewhere she'd been avoiding thinking about. She'd been avoiding thinking about Calder Flats in the specific way you avoid a room in a house where something bad happened, not refusing to go near it, but not walking directly toward it either. Stage Depot. Burke, who'd checked the ledger twice and come back with his apologetic expression. Town where she'd arrived with her trunk and her $42 and her reasonable expectations and found nothing. Russ money owed to her there. Not a large sum. The arrangement with Aldridge had involved a payment made in advance for the travel, Some she'd been told would be reimbursed at arrival by the man who was supposed to meet her. It had been a formal part of the correspondence, documented in letters she still had. Aldridge had never responded to her post-arrival letter, which she'd sent from Calder Flats before Graham found her on the road. She'd written once more from the ranch to the address she had for him, and that letter had come back undeliverable. There was a man named Aldridge who had made a contractual commitment to a woman he'd apparently never intended to keep. And while the sum wasn't enough to save the ranch on its own, it was money that belonged to her, and she intended to have it. And more than that, she intended to understand what had actually happened, because the not knowing had sat in her like a splinter she'd been working around. She had the sense, and had had it for some time, that Aldridge was a thread that led somewhere she hadn't followed. She was going to follow it. She put the letters back in the tin, locked it, and went to start breakfast. And when Graham came in from his early barn assessment, she told him what she was planning. Stood at the door and listened. Calder Flats is a day's ride, he said when she finished. The note is due in 10 days. I know that, too. She cracked eggs into the pan. Which is why I'm going tomorrow and coming back the day after. That leaves 8 days. For what? He said. What are you going to accomplish in Calder Flats that you can't accomplish from here? I'm going to find Price and put the documents in his hands, she said. Based in Calder Flats. I looked at the letterhead. I can be in front of him in person, which changes the conversation from correspondence to testimony. She turned from the stove. Well, and I'm going to find out what happened with Aldridge. Graham was quiet. That part's not about the ranch, she said. I know, he said. That's not why I'm quiet. She looked at him. I don't like you going alone, he said. You have a barn wall to fix and a leg that's not right yet, she said. Nora could help with the barn. I could, Graham, she said it plainly, not unkindly. You staying here and keeping things together is more useful than you coming with me. I know how to manage myself in a town. He looked at her with the expression he got when he was deciding whether to push further. Decided not to. She respected that. Take the better horse, he said. Gray, she's steadier on long roads, all right, she said. Take the money, he said. She turned back to the stove. What money? The cash I've got put aside, he said. From Fry's payment, after the portion went to Voss's interest account, $40. She was very still for a moment. Graham, if you're going to recover what Aldridge owes you, you might need to make a legal filing, he said. Costs money. Take it. She turned around and looked at him standing in the kitchen doorway with his dusty coat and his careful face and his injured leg, offering her $40 he could not afford to give. I'm not taking your emergency money, she said. It's not emergency money, he said. Operational money. You're operating. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing something inconvenient. I'll take 20, she said, and bring back what I don't use. He nodded, like this was a reasonable negotiation and not an act of a generosity she wasn't sure how to hold. Be back by Thursday, he said. Wednesday evening if the roads are dry, she said. She left the next morning before light. Nora came out to see her off, which Evelyn hadn't expected. Standing by the gray horse in the dark, checking the saddle bags, when she heard the porch door and looked up, and Nora was there with her coat over her nightgown and her hair loose, carrying something. Food for the road, Nora said. She held out a cloth-wrapped bundle Evelyn could smell bread, and something else, something spiced. She took it. You didn't have to do that, Evelyn said. I know, Nora said. I was up anyway. They stood in the pre-dawn dark for a moment. The horse breathed warm clouds into the cold air. He trusts you, Nora said. Not like she was accusing Evelyn of anything. Like she was reporting a fact she'd spent time verifying. He doesn't trust easily. After Mama died, he kind of closed up. Even with us sometimes. Like he was keeping everything behind glass. She looked at the horse rather than at Evelyn. He doesn't do that with you. Evelyn didn't say anything. Thought I'd tell you that, Nora said, before you go, in case it matters for whatever you're deciding. It matters, Evelyn said. Nora nodded. Then she turned and went back inside, practical as always, pulling her coat tight against the cold. Evelyn stood alone for a moment, with the horse and the dark and the bundle of bread in her hand. Then she mounted up and rode. Calder Flats looked different to her now. She'd arrived here 6 weeks ago with a trunk and a dwindling supply of hope, and it had looked like the end of something. She rode in now, in the late afternoon, with a saddlebag full of documents and $20 of borrowed money, and the specific purposefulness of a woman who knows exactly what she's here to do, and the town looked smaller than she remembered. More manageable. Burke was at the stage depot, He recognized her in the way of someone who feels guilty about a previous interaction and isn't sure how to handle the person reappearing. "Miss Hart," he said, "I didn't know you were still in the area." "I'm at the Reyes Ranch, east of town," she said. "I'm here on business. I'm looking for a man named Harlan Price, Inspector, with the Regional Land Office." Burke blinked at the change of subject. "Price is usually at the land office on Teller Street in the mornings. Takes his dinner at the hotel." "Thank you," she said. "One more thing. Charles Aldridge, do you know him? He was supposed to meet someone here about 6 weeks ago." Burke's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite surprise. "Aldridge," he said. He seemed to be deciding something. "He's not from around here. Came through last year, early spring. Some buying and selling, I think. Land something." He paused. "Left in May. I don't think he's coming back." She held his gaze. "Do you know who he was dealing with? Here in town?" Another pause, longer. "Voss," Burke said. "He had at least 2 meetings with Voss that I know of. We're at the hotel, not a secret." The name landed in her chest, like a stone into still water. "Thank you, Burke," she said, and her voice came out steady, which was a small achievement. She found a room at the hotel, and she sat on the edge of the bed with the tin box open on the table, and she let herself think about it properly for the first time. Voss. Aldridge. The correspondence that had drawn her across the country. Marriage arrangement that had collapsed on arrival. She didn't have proof of anything yet. She had a connection. Voss knew Aldridge. Aldridge had been dealing in land, and she had the particular cold feeling of someone who has just understood that what happened to them was not an accident. She had been used. She didn't know exactly how yet. She intended to find out. She put the lid back on the tin and went to sleep, because tomorrow was going to require everything she had, and self-righteous anger was not useful fuel. Harlan Price was a thin man in his 50s, with the slightly worn look of someone who has spent a career reading documents in inadequate light. He had a small office on Teller Street that smelled of paper and lamp oil, and he looked up when Evelyn came in with the particular expression of a man whose morning was not going the way he'd planned it. "Price," she said. "I'm Evelyn Hart. We've been corresponding about the Reyes note and Silas Voss." He knew the name immediately. She could see it in the small adjustment of his posture. "Miss Hart," he said, "I wasn't expecting you in person." "I know," she said. "I thought it would be faster." She put the tin box on the edge of his desk and opened it, and began placing the documents in front of him in order her own notes. Ada Hanley's account, which she'd gotten Ada to write and sign during a second visit 2 days before the storm. Run Martin Benedict's letter, with the 2 copies of the note attached, the one Benedict had signed, and the one as it appeared in the county record. Price picked up the county copy and the original and held them side by side. Quiet for almost a full minute. "This is a significant discrepancy," he said. "Quarter point on a note of that size, got over the period of the debt, amounts to a meaningful sum," Evelyn said. "And if he's done it once, I think you'll find he's done it more than once." Ada Hanley's account is there. She doesn't have the documents Benedict has, but her testimony is consistent with a pattern. Price set the papers down. He looked at her. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "Not the borrower on the Reyes note." "No," she said. "I'm the woman Graham Reyes let stay at his ranch when I had nowhere to go. And in 6 weeks, I've come to understand that Voss has been methodically destroying people who built things here, and I don't think that should continue." Price looked at her for another moment. "The note on the Reyes property comes due in 9 days, she said. "If you're going to do anything useful, the window is limited." "I understand that," he said, with a small sharpness that told her she'd pressed the right spot. "What I'd like," she said, "is for you to come to Millfield, before the due date, to inspect the original Reyes note in the county records against the copy Graham has." "I can't guarantee what I'll find," Price said. "I'm not asking you to guarantee anything," she said. "I'm asking you to look." He was quiet for a moment, looked at the documents again. "Thursday," he said. "I can be in Millfield Thursday." "The note is due Friday," she said. "I know when it's due," he said. "Thursday." "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. She found Aldridge's trail that afternoon. Took 3 conversations the hotel clerk, who remembered a man by that name, staying for 2 weeks in April of the previous year. A woman who ran a dry goods store and who had a good memory for faces. And finally a lawyer named Goss, who worked from a single-room office above the hardware store, and who, when Evelyn sat down across from him and put the stack of Aldridge's letters on his desk, went pale in a way that confirmed her suspicion before he said a single word. "I filed the correspondence arrangement," Goss said, carefully. "Mail order arrangement. It was I prepared the documentation. For Aldridge, she said. Yes. And did you know he wasn't intending to follow through on it? Goss looked at the letters. He looked at the window. He was a man in a difficult position, and he knew it, and Evelyn let him know that she knew it. I suspected, he said finally. The arrangement was it wasn't standard. Aldridge was using it to establish residency documentation, to show ties to the territory for a land purchase he was filing. Woman responding to the correspondence. Traveling here, it made the arrangement look genuine. Evelyn sat very still. He used the correspondence, she said. My letters. My traveling here. To establish residency for a land filing. Yes, Goss said. He had the decency to look ashamed. Whose land, she said. Goss looked at the window again. Mr. Goss, she said. I have traveled 3 days by rail and half a day by stage, and I have been at a ranch for 6 weeks working to prevent a fraudulent land grab. I am not a person who is going to be managed right now. Whose land? Reyes, Goss said. The filing was connected to establishing a claim that would supersede the Reyes property in a bankruptcy proceeding, if the note went unpaid. The room was very quiet. Evelyn looked at the letters on the desk, 11 months of careful, honest correspondence, writing she'd done at her mother's kitchen table, the photographs she'd sent, descriptions of herself, particular vulnerability of a woman who had nothing left in the place she was from reaching toward something that might be real. Never intended to be there, she said. Not a question. No, Goss said, and Voss arranged this. Goss was quiet for a moment. That was its own answer. Picked up her letters. All of them. She stacked them and put them in her bag. Going to write down what you just told me, she said. Every detail. The arrangement, Aldridge's purpose, who you filed it for and why. Going to sign it. Miss Hart, I can't. You prepared fraudulent residency documentation, she said. That's a crime in this territory. Writing down your honest account of what happened. Voluntarily, before this goes to a regional inspector, is the better option. She held his gaze. I am going to give you 20 minutes. When I come back, the account should be written and signed. If it isn't, I will go directly to Harlan Price's office and tell him what you told me, and the voluntary part will be gone. She stood up and left. She walked around the block twice. Her hands were shaking not from fear, from the particular fury of understanding what had been done to her, complete calculation of it, the fact that she had been a piece moved on someone else's board without knowing she was on a board at all. She walked it down to something usable. When she came back, Goss's written account was on the desk. Nay, she read it, asked him to add 2 clarifying sentences. Gee, and when he had, she folded it and put it with the rest. She was back at the Reyes ranch by Wednesday evening, as she'd promised. Graham was at the fence line. When she came up the drive, the east fence, she saw the one she'd repaired with him weeks ago, which had taken more damage in the storm than she'd realized. Gah! He saw her from a distance and stopped working and stood there watching her ride in, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders that the 10 days had been sitting in the room with him, too. She dismounted at the barn, and he came to meet her, and she handed him the gray's reins and said, Price is coming Thursday, and I know what Aldridge was. Gah! He looked at her. Gah! She told him, standing in the barn doorway with the evening coming down. What Goss had written in his account, the fraudulent arrangement, residency filing, the land claim that Voss had been building as a secondary avenue to the property, route that would activate if the note went unpaid and bypass the normal legal challenges. Graham listened without interrupting. His jaw got tight and stayed that way. Set the whole thing up, Graham said, when she finished. Both ends, the note and the claim. Yes, she said. And I was the document that made the claim look legitimate. Ah. He looked at her with something in his face that she didn't have a clean word for fury at Voss and something personal underneath it. Something about what had been done to her specifically. She thought he might say something about it, and he didn't, which was right, because there wasn't anything to say yet that would be adequate. Girls are inside, he said. Nora made supper. I need to wash up, she said. There's water on the stove, he said. She went in. 5 girls in various states of supper preparation turned at once, and Maisie came off her chair and crossed the kitchen in 4 running steps and grabbed Evelyn around the middle. Dom and Evelyn stood there with flour on the child's hands, transferring to her coat, and held her and looked at the kitchen, the lit stove. The food on the table. Ruth setting out cups with the efficiency of someone who has claimed that task. Petra arguing with Lily about something that became unimportant the moment she looked at them, and she thought, this is what Voss was trying to take. Not just the land. This. She held Maisie tighter for a moment and then let her go and rolled up her sleeves and washed her hands at the basin and sat down to supper. Thursday arrived with the particular quality of days that matter ordinary looking, behaving exactly like the day before, giving nothing away. Price came to Millfield on the morning stage. Evelyn had written ahead to the county clerk not to warn him, but to formally request a review of the Reyes note filing, which was a procedural right, and which the clerk could not refuse without reason. She was there when Price arrived, with the documents in the tin box, and Graham was beside her. Clerk's office was a small room that smelled of ink and old wood. Price set his case on the table and asked for the original filing. Clerk produced it. Price placed it beside the copy Graham had kept since signing. Difference was there. Not enormous a quarter point. 17 words changed in the repayment schedule, but it was there. Price read both documents 3 times in complete silence. Ran the clerk, who had been professionally uninterested for the first 10 minutes, but progressively more still as the silence went on. When was this filing made? Price asked the clerk. Day after the note was signed, the clerk said. And you processed it personally? Pause. I, the secondary clerk, I'll need to speak with him, Price said. Evelyn put Goss's written account on the table. She put Benedict's documents beside it. She put Ada Hanley's signed account beside that. I have a pattern, she said. 3 properties. The same modification to filed documents. Same sequence of events before each note came due. She looked at Price. And I have testimony that the fraudulent residency filing connected to this property was arranged by the same person who holds the note. Price looked at the documents for a long time. I'm going to need to hold these, he said. Copies, she said. You can have copies, I keep the originals. He looked at her. Then he nodded. The note due tomorrow, he said. Yes, she said. I can issue a temporary stay on foreclosure proceedings while I conduct a formal review, he said. 14 days. That's the limit of my authority on a stay. That's enough, she said. Graham beside her made a very small sound. She didn't look at him. Voss will contest it, Price said. I expect so, Evelyn said. And when he does, you'll have all of that. She gestured at the documents on the table. Contest it back. Price almost smiled. It was a small, contained almost smile, the expression of a methodical man who had just found a case with enough documentation to be worth the trouble. Miss Hart, he said. Are you a lawyer? I was a school teacher, she said. That explains it, he said, which she took as a compliment. Voss came to the ranch that same evening. She had expected him, and she had expected the timing. A man like Voss had eyes in the county clerk's office and would know about Price's visit within hours. She'd told Graham on the way home, he'll come today. Probably before dark, probably angrier than the last time. Came at 5 o'clock again with his 2 men, but this time he didn't bother with the professional manner. Came up the drive at a canter and pulled up hard in front of the house and got off his horse without tying it, which told her everything about his state of mind. Graham came out to the porch. Evelyn came with him. She'd made sure the girls were in the back of the house. She'd told Nora to keep them there regardless of what they heard, and she'd told Nora this in the specific tone of voice that meant it was not a request. When Nora had looked at her with the clear-eyed comprehension of a girl who had learned to recognize when adults were serious. Went to Price, Voss said. He was looking at Evelyn, not at Graham. Skipped past Graham entirely. She noted that. I met with Inspector Price. Yes, she said. You have no standing to file anything regarding this note, Voss said. You're not the borrower. You're not family. You're not even. He paused, and she could see him making the decision to say it. You are a woman who came to this territory to marry a man who didn't want her. You have no legal standing here. You have no position here. Whatever you think you're doing. I think I'm exposing a land fraud, she said. Kept her voice the same as it had been at Harker's with Fry. The same as it had been across from Price even. Clear, not raised. I think you know I can. You have letters and old grievances from people who lost their property legally. I have 2 copies of a note, she said. The one Graham signed and the one filed in the county record. Those are not the same document, Mr. Voss. Inspector Price has seen them both. Silence. One of the hired men behind Voss shifted his weight. The other was very still. You altered a legal document, she said. And then you arranged a fraudulent residency filing as a secondary foreclosure route, and the man who prepared that filing has given a written account of the arrangement. I have that account. She looked at him steadily. I also have Martin Benedict's original note and his county copy, and Ada Hanley's testimony about the fence lines in the well. Voss's face had gone through several changes in the last 30 seconds. She watched them. The first flash of anger, then the rapid calculation, then something harder and colder setting in underneath. You think a territory inspector and a handful of papers are going to stop me, he said. I think they already have, she said. You have 14 days of stay. When those 14 days end, Price will have finished his review. And whatever he finds in that review will go to the territorial court, not to the county clerk you've been eating dinner with. Behind her, she heard the porch boards shift. Someone had come to the doorway. She didn't turn around. Voss looked past her, and his expression changed again. She knew without looking that it was Nora who had come out, and then she heard Maisie's voice. And then it wasn't just Nora. She turned. All 5 of them were on the porch. Nora Ruth, Lily Petra, and Maisie, who was holding Nora's hand. They were standing behind Evelyn and Graham in a line that was not planned and not rehearsed and was more effective than anything she could have arranged deliberately. Voss looked at them. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Graham, put his boot back in his stirrup, and mounted his horse. This isn't over, he said. I know, Evelyn said. Come back when you have a lawyer. He rode away. His 2 men followed without looking at anyone. Dust settled. Maisie, from behind Evelyn, said, Did we win? Graham let out the breath he'd been holding. Not yet, Evelyn said. Still in it. She turned around and Maisie ran forward and grabbed her hand, and behind her 4 more faces were looking at her with various configurations of relief and pride and residual fear. And Graham was looking at her with something she recognized now, even if she hadn't always had a word for it. Squeezed Maisie's hand. Go inside, she said. I need to write some letters. She wrote 3 letters that night. One to Price, documenting the substance of Voss's visit and his explicit statements, so there was a record. One to Martin Benedict, telling him what she'd put before the inspector and asking if he'd be willing to appear in person if a formal hearing was called. 3rd letter was the one she'd been putting off for 6 weeks. She addressed it to the office of the Territorial Land Court, Glun, and it outlined, in plain and documented language, the full account of what she'd discovered about the fraudulent correspondence arrangement, Aldridge, Goss's account, connection to Voss, the way her own letters had been used as documentation for a fraudulent residency filing. She signed her name clearly at the bottom. She sealed all 3 and set them by the door for morning. Then she sat in the quiet kitchen for a moment, the fire banked, the lamp turned low, the house breathing around her in the way houses breathe when everyone in them is finally asleep. She thought about what Voss had said. You are a woman who came to this territory to marry a man who didn't want her. She thought about how it had been designed to diminish her, to reduce her to her worst moment, her most visible failure, and make everyone in earshot see her through that frame instead of any other. She thought about how, 6 weeks ago, it might have worked. She put her palms flat on the table carefully, because the right one still pulled when she pressed it, and she looked at the 3 letters by the door, and the tin box with its careful contents, and the lamp making its small warm circle against all the dark around it. Then she went to bed, because tomorrow the work continued, and she needed to be rested for it. The 14 days of Price's stay felt nothing like the 10 days before them. 10 days had been a countdown. 14 days was something else, a held breath, a suspended moment in which everything was in motion and nothing was yet resolved. John and Evelyn had learned enough about herself in the past 7 weeks to know that suspended moments were harder for her than active crisis. Active crisis, you moved. In suspension, you waited, and waiting required a discipline she had to rebuild every morning from scratch. She rebuilt it the same way each time. Get up before the girls. Start the fire. Put the water on. Stand at the kitchen window for exactly as long as it took the water to heat, and look at the ranch in the early light. Barn, wall, repaired now. Graham and a neighbor named Tate had put 4 days into it, and it was solid, better than before in some ways. New boards fitted tight where the old ones had gone soft. Garden, which was doing something she hadn't entirely anticipated. The 4 surviving squash seedlings had not only held, they'd put out runners in the weeks since the storm, with the specific aggressive optimism of plants that have survived something and decided not to be cautious about it anymore. Fence line mended. The tools put away. She looked at all of it every morning and she thought, this exists. Whatever happens in Millfield, whatever Price finds or doesn't find, whatever the territorial court does with her letter, this ranch exists right now, and these girls are fed, and the barn is standing, and the garden is growing. It was not a comfortable thought exactly. It was a stabilizing one. Martin Benedict wrote back within a week. He would come. He'd been waiting. Guy, he wrote, in plain, unembellished language, for someone to ask. kept the records because he'd believed, without much evidence to support the belief, that someday they would matter to someone. He would take the stage from dimming and be in Millfield by the Wednesday of the second week. She wrote back immediately and told him what time to arrive and where to meet her, and she felt something release in her chest when she sealed that letter, the particular relief of a piece falling into place that you weren't certain would fall. Ada Hanley sent word through a Murphy Ranch hand that she'd be there too. She didn't say much else. She didn't need to. The thing Evelyn hadn't accounted for was the neighbors. She'd known the ranching community here was not large people were spread across considerable distances, connected by necessity rather than proximity, and their relationships with each other had the particular quality of people who needed each other's help in emergencies, and were therefore careful not to make unnecessary enemies. She'd assumed that Voss's long presence in the area meant a certain amount of loyalty, or at minimum compliant silence from people who'd seen what he did to those who challenged him. She'd underestimated what people will say when they believe someone is actually listening. Started with a man named Cal Drummond. Came to the ranch on the 5th day of the stay and sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his lap and told Graham and Evelyn that Voss had offered to buy his property 3 times in the last 2 years, and that the last time he'd declined. Prize bull had been found dead in a field with no evident cause. He hadn't reported it because he hadn't known who to report it to. It assumed, as people assume when power is sufficiently consolidated in a place, that there was no one. There's an inspector, Evelyn told him, and a hearing date. Will you write it down and sign it? He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. 2 days later, a woman named Petra Solis, no relation to the Reyes daughters, came with her son, who was 17 and who held his hat the same way Drummond had, and she told a story about a water diversion that had mysteriously redirected itself away from her property line shortly before Voss's first offer to buy. She'd always known it was deliberate. She'd never said so to anyone because saying so out loud felt like inviting the next thing. Evelyn took her account down in her own hand while the woman spoke. Me read it back, corrected 2 details at Petra Solis's instruction, again, and had her sign it. Tin box was no longer sufficient. She'd moved to a leather folder she'd bought in Calder Flats. By the end of the first week, it was thick with signed accounts, dates, descriptions of animals found dead and fence lines cut, and well water that had gone bad without explanation. Every one of them alone was a complaint without remedy. Together they were a portrait of a man who had operated with perfect confidence that no one would ever hold it all up to the light at once. Graham watched this accumulation with the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. How did you know to do this? He asked one evening. She was at the kitchen table organizing the accounts by date, and he was across from her with a cup of coffee going cold, watching her work. Didn't, she said. I knew to collect what Price needed. Rest of them came, because they heard someone was collecting. Created a place for it, he said. She looked up at him. People already had the stories, she said. They just didn't think anyone would want them. He looked at her with that steady attention she'd learned to read, the one that meant he was thinking something he wasn't certain how to say. Graham, she said, say it. He looked at his coffee. I've been trying to figure out how to ask you something. Been trying to figure it out for about 2 weeks, she said. I've noticed. He looked up. Something in his expression shifted toward something more unguarded than she'd seen from him since the barn, since the night after the storm when they'd sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. When this is done, he said, the hearing, Voss, all of it. I want to ask you something when it's done. I know, she said. I said I'd wait until it was resolved. You did. I'm going to keep that promise, he said. I just want you to know that the question is there, so that when I ask it, it isn't a surprise. She looked at him across the table with its organized stack of other people's grievances, and the lamp making its small circle and the house quiet around them. It isn't a surprise, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. Good, he said. The hearing was not dramatic in the way that hearings in stories are dramatic. It was held in the county land office in Millfield, in a room that was too small for the number of people who showed up, on a Thursday morning in weather that had turned cold overnight with the specific rudeness of early autumn in the territory. Price sat at the head of the table with a territorial court representative named Lund, who had come from Santa Fe and who said almost nothing for the first hour and whose presence alone was significant. Voss was there with a lawyer from Albuquerque Expensive. Evelyn could tell from the suit, which was a quality of expensive that didn't exist locally. The lawyer's name was Hendrick, and he was good, which she'd expected. And his opening position was that the discrepancy between the two copies of the note was a clerical error. That Benedict's comparison was based on a faulty recollection of what he'd signed, and that the constellation of complaints from local ranchers represented nothing more than the natural grievances of people who had sold or lost their properties in legally conducted transactions and were now seeking to reframe their own failures as someone else's crime. Coherent argument. Evelyn had anticipated it. She let Hendrik finish. Then she put Benedict's two documents in front of Lund, the original note in Benedict's handwriting, initialed on every page the way a careful man initials documents, and the county copy. She put the Reyes note and its county copy beside it. Then, from the leather folder, she produced two more pairs, the Hanley note and its county copy, which Ada had retrieved from her own records with the specific energy of a woman who had been waiting to do something useful with her anger for 2 years, and a fourth pair from Cal Drummond, who had kept his original out of the same instinct that had led Benedict to keep his, a man who didn't entirely trust the world, keeping a copy of the world's promises to him. 4 notes, 4 county filings, the same quarter-point discrepancy in all 4, in the same position in the document, in what Price confirmed was the same clerical hand. Hendrik looked at them. He didn't say clerical error again after that. Goss's written account was the piece that shifted Lund's expression. He read it twice, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who was accustomed to finding the precise weight of a document, set it down and looked at Voss across the table. Voss was looking at Evelyn. She looked back. She didn't perform anything for him, no triumph, no coldness, no particular expression. She just looked at him the way she looked at problems, steadily and with clear eyes, and without the particular fear that comes from believing the problem is bigger than you are. He looked away first. The hearing went for 4 hours. Martin Benedict testified in person, his voice careful and even, a man reading from memory that he'd kept organized for exactly this purpose. Ada Hanley spoke briefly, but with a precision that surprised even Evelyn. She had clearly been composing this account in her head for 2 years and knew every word she meant to say. Cal Drummond corroborated. Petra Solis corroborated. 2 other ranchers Evelyn hadn't spoken to directly had heard about the hearing through the particular channels that information travels in small communities, and had come with their own documents, their own dates, their own stories of wells and fence lines and animals. Voss's lawyer spoke less as the morning went on. He asked questions and received answers that complicated his next question, and by midday he had adopted the strategy of the professionally careful man trying to limit damage rather than the professionally aggressive man trying to win. 2 in the afternoon, Lund said he had seen sufficient documentation to initiate a full territorial court review. Stay on the Reyes note would be extended pending that review. All note proceedings against properties associated with the complaints before him would be frozen pending review. He looked at Voss. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I would advise you to engage your attorney in preparing a complete response to these allegations. Territorial court will be in contact." Voss stood. He was still a large man, and the room was still small, and he used both facts as long as he could. Then he left, with Hendrik behind him, and the room rearranged itself in their absence, people exhaling, shoulders dropping, a specific physical release of a group of people who have been braced for something and are now, cautiously, unbracing. Evelyn sat still for a moment. Martin Benedict, across the table, looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "You kept the record," she said. "I just knew who to bring them to." "Someone had to know," he said. "That's the thing. Someone had to know, and then had to do something about the knowing." He paused. We'd all given up on that part. She looked at the leather folder in her hands. She thought about the woman who had sat in the dirt under a cottonwood tree 7 weeks ago and counted $42, and believed, with the specific despair of someone who has run out of other options, that the chapter she was in was an ending. She thought I was wrong about that, not in a triumphant way. Just factually, she'd been wrong about what that moment was. Graham was outside the land office when she came out. He'd been there for the last hour, he'd been in the room for the first 3, and she'd seen him leave at some point when the testimony was becoming repetitive, which she'd understood as the decision of a practical man who had absorbed what he needed to absorb and didn't need to sit in it longer. She found him now leaning against the building's exterior, hat in his hands, looking at the street. He looked at her when she came out. She gave him the plain version. Lund was initiating a full review. Stay was extended. Voss's proceedings were frozen. It was not a final resolution. The territorial court moved slowly, and Voss's lawyer would complicate everything he could complicate. But the mechanism was engaged now. Yen mechanisms engaged by territorial courts with documented fraud complaints tended to reach their conclusions regardless of how much money sat on one side of the scale. Graham listened. Then he said the ranch is safe, she said. For now. And I think for good eventually. It won't be fast. Nodded. He looked at his hat. My father built the original house, he said. Took him 3 years. He used to say he built it board by board, because he couldn't afford to think about the whole thing at once. He paused. Clara planted the garden the second summer. She said she wanted to see something growing. I know, Evelyn said, Nora told me. He looked up at her. We should go home, he said. It was such a plain sentence, such an ordinary arrangement of words. She felt it land in her somewhere specific and stayed very still for a moment to let it settle. Yes, she said. They rode back together in the afternoon that was going gold at the edges, the particular slant of October light that makes everything look deliberate, like the landscape has been thinking about itself and decided to be beautiful. She didn't say much, and neither did he. Gaunt's and the silence between them was the kind that had been building for 7 weeks and had achieved its own texture, not uncomfortable, not romantic in any performed sense, just present, like weather. Halfway home, he said, I want to ask you that question now. She looked at him from the side. You said when it was resolved. It's resolved enough, he said. She looked at the road ahead. All right, she said. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, she thought, but choosing. I want you to stay, he said. Not because the ranch needs someone. Not because the girls need someone, though they do. Because I want you here, specifically you. He kept his eyes on the road. I know you didn't come here looking for this. I know what you came here for, and I know what happened, and I know this is not the life you planned. He paused. Seems like the life that happened, and I'd like it to keep happening. You'd consider staying as my wife. Road was long, and the light was doing its deliberate October thing. And she thought about Columbus, about her mother's kitchen, about the letters she'd written for 11 months to a man who had only ever wanted her signature. She thought about the stage depot in Calder Flats and Burke's apologetic face, and the trunk she'd left sitting there that he'd held for her, and that she'd retrieved on her second trip, which was now in her room at the ranch with its contents organized, and the photograph of Aldridge removed and not replaced. She thought about 5 girls who had reorganized their lives around her presence, with the particular adaptability of children who have already survived one large change and discovered they are more capable than they knew. She thought about Nora in the pre-dawn dark, handing her a bundle of food for the road. She thought about Maisie's hands wrapped around hers that first day, small and immediate and completely without calculation. She thought about Graham in the burning loft, looking at her with clearer eyes than she'd expected. She thought about what she'd said to him weeks ago in the kitchen. I've been the person who needed help and didn't get it, and it turns out I'd rather be on the other side of that. She'd been talking about the ranch then, about the practical problem. She understood now, riding beside him in the October light, that she'd been talking about something larger than she'd known how to admit at the time. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again, clearer. I'll stay as your wife. He held her gaze for a long moment. The horse moved under her, steadily, indifferent to the weight of what had just been said. All right, he said. All right, she said. They rode the rest of the way home without saying much more, which was right. Because some things don't need elaboration. They need to be set down and allowed to be real, which takes longer than saying them and can't be hurried. Girls were waiting. All 5 of them, which was not a coincidence, which meant Nora had organized it, which meant Nora had understood something about what this day might be before Evelyn had left for the hearing that morning. Guy. They were on the porch in the evening cold without their coats, because they'd been inside and had come out in a hurry when they heard the horses. Maisie came off the porch at a run, and Evelyn was barely off the gray before Maisie had both arms around her waist. Work? Maisie demanded. It worked, Evelyn said. Maisie made a sound of pure, uncomplicated relief that Evelyn felt in her sternum. Graham came around from tying the horses and stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at his 4 remaining daughters arrayed on the porch in various states of barely contained emotion. Petra had both hands over her mouth. Lily was gripping the porch railing. Ruth was doing the thing Ruth did when she was moved, standing very still and letting it happen to her, not performing anything, just receiving it. Nora was looking at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at her, with Maisie still attached to her middle. Ask me, Evelyn said to Nora specifically. A pause. I know, Nora said. I said yes. Nora's jaw moved. She was doing the thing she did when she was working to stay composed, the slight tightening at the corners of her mouth, the small controlled breath. Then she came down the porch steps, and she put her arms around Evelyn, who hadn't expected it, and stood for a moment with both surprise and Maisie before she managed to get one arm up and around Nora's shoulders. They held that for a moment. She's still here, Nora said quietly, into Evelyn's shoulder. Mama, she's in the garden and the recipe box and the way I know how to mend a hem. She's not gone. I know, Evelyn said. She's not going anywhere. I just needed you to know that I know that, Nora said. I know, Evelyn said. I know you know. Nora stepped back. She'd been crying, which she would not acknowledge directly. Aunt Evelyn did not acknowledge it either, because that was the right thing to do. Petra had released both hands from her mouth and was now using them to grab her father around the middle. Graham was standing in the middle of the porch embrace, looking like a man who has been ambushed by something good and is trying to stand steady inside it. Lily was talking. She was always talking, which was one of the things Evelyn had come to understand was a feature rather than a flaw. Lily's talking was the sound of her processing the world out loud, and you just had to be willing to be in the room with the processing. Ruth came to stand beside Evelyn. I'm glad you stayed, Ruth said. Simply quietly, the way Ruth said everything. I'm glad I stayed too, Evelyn said. I wasn't sure you would, Ruth said early on. You kept saying just for today. I know, Evelyn said. You stopped saying it around week 3, Ruth said. I noticed. Evelyn looked at her. You didn't say anything. I didn't want to make you notice you'd stopped, Ruth said. In case you started again. Evelyn stood there for a moment with the particular feeling of being seen clearly by a 15-year-old, which was a specific kind of scene that you couldn't really prepare for. Smart, she said. I know, Ruth said with a composure that was almost funny and absolutely genuine. Territorial Court's full review took 4 months. Evelyn had expected that, or something like it. She'd told Graham to expect it, and they'd absorbed it the way you absorb the things you can't shorten by building around them. Barn was fully repaired by November. The squash that had survived the storm came in thin but real in early October, enough to put up a respectable number of jars alongside the rest of the preserving work. Aunt Evelyn stood in front of those jars lined up on the cellar shelving on an afternoon in late October, and felt something that was not pride exactly, but was in the same family the satisfaction of having made something that would last through winter. She and Graham were married in November. Small, practical, in the county clerk's office in Millfield, because neither of them was interested in ceremony for ceremony's sake. The 5 girls there, and a neighbor named Tate, who had helped with the barn and who seemed genuinely pleased to be asked, and Burke from the stage depot, who had somehow heard and shown up uninvited but was welcome anyway. Nora stood beside Evelyn and held the small bunch of dried lavender she'd cut from Clara's herb bed, and Evelyn held it through the brief proceeding and afterward gave it back to Nora to keep, and Nora took it and put it in her pocket without saying anything, which was the right response. Maisie cried, which surprised everyone, including Maisie. I'm not sad, she explained loudly to Burke, who was the nearest adult. It's a lot. That's usually what crying is, Burke said with unexpected wisdom. Lily made a speech that no one had asked her to make, and that was 3 minutes long, and that managed to be both mortifying and correct. Graham looked at the ceiling for the duration of it, and Evelyn looked at her hands, and neither of them stopped her, because she was right about everything she said, and sometimes you let people be right. Ruth stood in the back and watched all of it with her clear, steady eyes, and after, when they were all outside in the November cold heading toward the wagon, she fell into step beside Evelyn and said nothing. And Evelyn said nothing, and they walked together in the comfortable silence of 2 people who understand each other and don't need to prove it. Territorial Court issued its findings in February. Silas Voss was found to have committed systematic fraud in the filing of debt instruments across 11 properties over a period of 6 years. Modified notes were ruled invalid in their altered form and reissued at their original terms. Fraudulent residency filing connected to the Reyes property was ruled void. 3 additional complaints, filed by ranchers who had come forward during the review period, emboldened, Price said in his letter to Evelyn, by the fact that the original complaints had been taken seriously were incorporated into the findings. Voss's landholdings, many of which had been acquired through the fraud, were subject to a reversal proceeding that would take another year to fully resolve. Hendrick, his lawyer, withdrew from representation midway through the review. which was a signal that anyone who understood how lawyers worked could read clearly. Evelyn read Price's letter at the kitchen table on a February morning with Graham beside her, the girls at various stages of breakfast around them. Gone when she finished, she put the letter down and sat for a moment in the ordinary noise of the household. Maisie asking Lily to pass the bread, Lily telling Maisie to ask nicely, Ruth already done with breakfast and reading, Petra braiding her own hair with the competence she'd developed over months, Nora at the stove. Ordinary morning, ordinary noise, it's done, she said. Graham picked up the letter and read it himself, which took longer because he read carefully rather than quickly, and she watched his face as he went through it, the specific journey of someone receiving news they'd needed for a long time and working to take it in fully rather than just relieved. Set it down. The Benedicts might get their property back, he said. Some of them might, she said. The reversal proceedings aren't guaranteed. Possible. He nodded. Ada Hanley, he said. Same, she said. It depends on what the reversal proceedings find. She didn't want to overclaim it. The letter was real, and the findings were real, and the mechanism was doing what she'd believed it could do. She'd seen enough of the distance between a finding and a resolution to know that people shouldn't be told things were fixed until they were actually fixed. Ada Hanley deserved the truth of what was possible, not a clean story that might let her down. Graham looked at her. You think about everything twice, he said. The way other people think about things once. I think about some things 3 times, she said. Almost smiled. The almost smile had become a smile more often in recent months. She'd noticed. Spring came the way spring comes to that part of the territory suddenly, aggressively, like weather that has made a decision. Garden came up in the places she'd prepared, and in some places she hadn't, Clara's perennial herbs reasserting themselves from the root in the particular way of things that have been there long enough to know they belong. Evelyn found Nora in the garden on a Saturday morning in March, kneeling in the sage bed, doing the same work Evelyn had been doing that afternoon months ago, when Nora had come to stand behind her and told her that Clara used to walk through here after supper, just to see it. She stood at the garden's edge for a moment. Nora looked up. Lavender's coming back, Nora said. I know, Evelyn said. Does that? Mama would have been pleased about the squash, Nora said. Squash was a near thing, Evelyn said. Don't give me more credit than it deserves. 4 plants came back from 12, Nora said. I think that's exactly as much credit as it deserves. Evelyn looked at the garden, the beds she'd rebuilt, and the beds Clara had laid down years before, and the places where they'd worked side by side without intending it. The plants that were hers, and the plants that were Clara's, and the new ones they'd put in together. Her and Nora, on a day in January when the ground was cold but workable, and Nora had said she wanted to try garlic. I've been thinking about something, Nora said. She was still looking at the sage. Came here because of a man who used you, and then you stayed because of I don't know exactly. Because it made sense. Because you're practical. That's part of it, Evelyn said. Then you fought for it, Nora said. Not because it was yours by any legal right. Not because anyone could have made you. She paused. Just decided it was worth fighting for. Yes, Evelyn said. Nora was quiet for a moment. I think that's what love is, Nora said. Not the feeling, the decision. Evelyn stood at the garden's edge in the March morning and thought about 11 months of careful letters and $42.10 on a man who'd looked at her, sitting in the dirt under a cottonwood, and offered her water without making it complicated. She thought about a burning loft and a barn beam and a ledger of other people's grievances she'd stayed up late to organize. She thought about Graham's face when he asked her to stay, and the particular quality of yes that she'd been able to say, not desperate, not grateful, not afraid, just clear. Yes of someone who has chosen rather than accepted. Think you're right, she said. Nora got up from her knees and brushed the dirt from her hands, and they stood together at the edge of Clara's garden in the spring morning. The 2 of them, the woman who had built it and the woman who had kept it alive, both present in the work of the ground beneath them. There was no clean moment of completion. That was the thing Evelyn had learned, the thing that took her longest to learn, and that she thought was perhaps the truest thing about a life lived honestly. There is no moment when everything is finished and the terms are settled, and you can look around and say, here it is. This is what I was building toward. There is just the morning, and the work, and the people beside you in the work, and the decision, made over and over again, that this is worth it. She'd made that decision in the dirt under a cottonwood tree without knowing she was making it. She'd made it again over a ledger and in a burning barn, and across a table from a land inspector, and in front of a man on horseback who wanted her to be ashamed of surviving. She made it now, standing in the garden in the March light with her stepdaughter beside her. And she would make it tomorrow, and the day after that, perfectly and specifically, and with the full knowledge of everything it cost. Some people come to the place they belong by a clean road, with a map and good weather. Others come to it by the road that was the broken one, the one that wasn't supposed to go anywhere, the one that handed them something they hadn't asked for and turned out to be the thing. Evelyn Hart had crossed a continent for the wrong reason and arrived at the right place. She'd been used and stranded and left in the dirt, and she had gotten up from the dirt and looked at what was in front of her and decided it was worth her effort. She had not rescued anyone. She hadn't been rescued either. She'd stood in the room with a family that was falling apart and made herself useful and let herself be changed by it, which is a different and more honest thing than being someone's salvation. Ranch would go on needing work, because ranches do. Graham would go on being a man who expressed himself sideways and incompletely, because that was who he was, and you don't change that at 40. Girls would grow and leave and come back and leave again. Nora would plant garlic every January because she'd decided she liked it and because it had been hers to decide. Maisie would always talk too much and mean every word. Ruth would always be right in the quiet way of people whose accuracy is not diminished by the fact that it goes unannounced. And Evelyn would be here, in this kitchen, in this garden, on this piece of ground that she had chosen and that had, in its particular way, chosen her back. She was not a woman who had found what she was looking for. She was a woman who had found something better than what she'd been looking for, which is harder to achieve and requires a specific kind of willingness, the willingness to be wrong about what you needed, and to be grateful for it. Morning went on. The garden was full of growing things. Inside the house, she could hear Maisie's voice, unbroken and immediate and completely alive, talking to anyone who would listen. Evelyn breathed in the cold, clean air of a March morning and thought, this is it. Not a destination. Not the end of the hard parts. Just this. Just exactly this. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was home.